Welcome to the live session of Raises Academy. We are today conducting a neurology discussion on the mock test which was published yesterday. Today we will be discussing the questions which were published yesterday and a brief note on neuroanatomy. Let's start into the session. Myself, Dr. Yashwant. I'm a consulting neurologist in Apollo Health City, Hyderabad. So, coming to the functional unit of the neuron, functional unit of the nervous system is a neuron. Neuron consists of cell body, axon, and the dendrites. These all together, all the neurons will be at one place called as gray matter, whereas all the axons with their surrounding myelin together called as white matter. Here in this MRI image, you can look at the peripheral 6 mm of the cortex is called as the gray matter, whereas underlying it the white matter, the white content is called as the white matter. Most of it will be the white matter, and the gray matter is the place where the whole processing, analyzing, receiving information will be done, whereas the white matter is to do the conduction of information from one location of the brain to the other location of the brain. So, brain is divided into predominantly four lobes. Among that, frontal lobe is the biggest lobe. In the frontal lobe, this part of the frontal lobe, which is in the anterior most, is called as the prefrontal cortex. This prefrontal cortex is the one which makes the difference with the other animals in the whole world and on the earth and the humans. This prefrontal cortex mainly manages the social behavior and personality of the body. And remaining lobes are parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. We'll go a little bit detail into these topics. This is the medial or sagittal section of the brain, in which we can clearly make out the most interior one is the corpus callosum, and the posterior one and the lower and posterior one is the cerebellum. And this one is the brainstem, which will has three components. The one is midbrain, and this one is the middle one is the pons, and the lower one is the medulla oblongata. Okay, even though our anatomical sequences look like this, but actually the brain looks this way. With on opening the skull, it looks so complex with completely meninges, and also veins and arteries will be there. Coming to the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe predominantly has 5 frontal subcortical circuits, predominantly motor and oculomotor. Motor is the one which is present just before the central sulcus, that is called as motor area and also called as motor homunculus, and just before that is a premotor area, and just in front, anterior to the premotor area, is the frontal eye field, which takes care of the eye movements, that is oculomotor area. And the most part of the anterior part of the frontal lobe is concerned with the executive dysfunction, executive function, inhibition of the emotions, social behavior, all these things. So this prefrontal cortex is divided into dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, orbitofrontal cortex, and anterior cingulate cortex. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is the main important part of the frontal lobe, which deals with planning, execution, and with the to perform a task. Whereas the orbital frontal deals with the personality, and any abnormality in the orbital frontal cortex will leads to personality disorders, example like obsessive compulsive personality. Whereas the anterior cingulate cortex will have an empathy to the situation, and also controls the bladder. So that is nothing but the paracentral lobule. So this is what the prefrontal cortex, these are the components of prefrontal cortex. Coming to the working memory is mainly by the prefrontal cortex, which deals with just immediate gathering of the information and carrying to some other place, but it will not be retained into a short-term memory. So working memory is a part of prefrontal cortex. It is just like a waiter taking our order and making the order ready, but he doesn't remember after 1 hour what order we have made. So this is called as working memory. Next one is parietal lobe. In the parietal lobe, you can clearly make out this is a just before the central sulcus, just behind the central sulcus is the primary sensory cortex, and behind that there will be the different kinds of functioning will be there of the parietal lobe. So coming to the left hemisphere, it deals with the language. In the language will be comprehension, which deals with comprehension, reading and writing. The left hemisphere has the deals with the comprehension, reading and writing, whereas the calculation, it makes simple calculation, takes care of by left hemisphere, whereas non-verbal symbolization, that is called as pantomime, it is just nothing but showing the gestures, like putting a namaste in, with a salam, or showing it as super, and non-verbal symbolization is nothing but communicating with the gestures, whereas the right hemisphere deals with construction skills, dressing apraxia. So construction skills, dressing apraxia is also construction skill. Calculations also with geometric orientation of the digits and all those, which needs multiplication and divisions, which actually needs orientation of the and alignment of the digits so that they can make a multiple bigger calculation. So right hemisphere actually deals with geometric orientation of our presence in the room, our presence in the world, and orientation of everything. So any defect in the right hemisphere causes inattention, also called as neglect. So this is so sensory homunculus. In the sensory homunculus, this is the lateral part of the brain, and this is the medial part of the brain. Lateral part of the brain is more concerned with the upper limb and also face, whereas the medial part of the brain in the parietal lobe is concerned with the lower limb. So this is the depiction of the sensory homunculus. In this image, the things which are big and prominent have more sensitive areas, whereas small and normal size or normal sensitizations are less sensitized areas. So coming to the cortical sensation, parietal lobe also has 2-point discrimination, tactile localization, stereognosis, and graphesthesia. Occipital lobe is more often concerned with the vision, visual processing, and also visual memory. Any impairment in occipital lobe, it causes hemianopias, and if both the lobes are involved, that causes cortical blindness. Temporal lobe, lateral part is concerned with the auditory. Predominant areas Heschel gyrus, whereas the medial part is concerned with the memory and also storage of the memories. Medial temporal lobe is associated with memory, predominantly short-term memory, whereas amygdala, it is associated with social behavior, and it is part of the Papez circuit, which is part of the limbic system. Okay, coming to the language, language has multiple components. When someone comes with a language difficulty to our clinic, we should actually assess in the form of naming, repetition, fluency, comprehension, reading, and writing. But here in this image, you can see Broca's area, which is the inferior, which is present in the inferior frontal gyrus, will actually an area of motor area, which actually deals with production of, which gives the guidance to the vocal cords regarding the production of sounds, whereas the Wernicke's area deals with analyzing the information, what other person has spoken. Initially, when someone speaks, the information first reaches the ear. With the eighth nerve, it reaches the eighth nerve nucleus. Then it reaches the auditory area, that is Heschel gyrus. Heschel gyrus will be in the lateral part of the temporal lobe. From the lateral part of the temporal lobe, information will be passed on to the Wernicke's area. In the Wernicke's area, the information what the other person has spoken will be analyzed and then will be thought. Then that information in the Wernicke's area will be passed on to the Broca's area with the help of arcuate fasciculus, and this motor area gives the commands to the larynx what to speak and how to speak out for the articulation. This is how, when someone hears how he speaks, is a mechanism of speech. So in this image, you can clearly see interior structures predominantly from the involving the frontal lobe and temporal lobe. These are the amygdala, hypothalamus. All these structures together form the limbic system. This is called as Pape's circuit. Limbic system is often associated with social behavior and also emotions. This limbic system prepares for the emotions, like any kind of emotion, fear, love, fear, like any anxiety, anything will be by the social. Then this information will be taken, this processed, this information will be sent to the frontal lobe. In the frontal lobe, whether that emotion should be manifested, emotion should be shown out or not, will be decided by the frontal lobe. So this is how the limbic system and frontal lobe will be under the coordination before giving some emotion and social behavior. So coming to the questions which we have published yesterday, we will discuss those questions now. A 26-year-old man presents with foot drop, which he developed after a fall while playing football. On examination, there is weakness of foot dorsiflexion and eversion, and weakness of the extension of the great toe. Foot inversion is preserved. He has some sensory loss over the dorsum of foot. The ankle jerk is present, and other examination is within normal limits. Okay. How we should analyze this question? It is an young male who presented us with foot drop. Foot drop means he is unable to lift his foot. That is difficulty in lifting the foot. That is nothing but dorsiflexion of the foot. On examination, there is weakness of the foot dorsiflexion and eversion. Okay, this weakness of foot dorsiflexion and eversion is predominantly by the tibialis anterior muscle. Tibialis anterior muscle is predominantly supplied by the deep peroneal nerve, and that is or part of the common peroneal nerve. And he has some sensory loss over the dorsum of the foot. Dorsum of the foot is predominantly supplied by the superficial peroneal nerve of the common peroneal nerve. So when the both nerves are involved, that indicates the common point of both nerves is involved. What is the common point for both the nerves? In this image, we should see this is the dorsum surface of the foot, where the superficial peroneal nerve supplies the area, whereas this part, there is the tibialis anterior will be in this location. This part is supplied by the deep peroneal nerve. So there are two branches, superficial peroneal and deep peroneal nerve. Where these two unite is the place where probably this might have got damaged. So these two get united, almost these two branch out, and before that there will be, that happens near the fibula. So and this peroneal nerve branch will be started from the just above the femur and descend downwards and divide into branches at the level of fibula. So here, and most common location of the reason for common peroneal nerve palsy is the fracture fibula. So in this MCQ, both deep peroneal nerve and superficial peroneal nerve both are involved. So it is a common peroneal nerve at the head of the fibula is the right answer. Why common peroneal nerve at the ankle is not the right answer? Because there will be no motor related nerve at the ankle region. Why L5 nerve root is not involved? Because L5 nerve root, they will have minimal low back ache since long time, and also they will have foot inverters weakness also. But in our question, there is no weakness of the inverters, as that is not clearly mentioned here. Sciatic nerve at the sciatic notch. If the sciatic nerve is involved, there will be a mild pain from the low back radiating to the back aspect of the thigh and also lateral aspect of the thigh, and it will be radiating down, and on much more compression, even there will be even extensors of the knee weakness also will be there. So but that is not mentioned here. In tibial nerve of the popliteal fossa, if the tibial nerve at the popliteal fossa is involved, there will be even even plantar flexion weakness will be there, but that is not there in our question. So answer is common peroneal nerve at the head of the fibula. So there are other syndromes when mononeuropathies are involved. We should think of entrapment syndromes. What are the locations of entrapment syndrome? For the median nerve, it is carpal tunnel syndrome at the entrapment location. Whereas for the ulnar nerve, it is cubital tunnel syndrome or tardy ulnar nerve palsy. For the radial nerve, it is Saturday night palsy. Usually it is at the spiral groove of the humerus. Whereas for lateral femoral cutaneous nerve, entrapment syndrome is meralgia paresthetica. Whereas for sciatic nerve, entrapment syndrome is piriformis syndrome. For peroneal nerve, it is Captain Chair syndrome or strawberry picker palsy. For tibial nerve entrapment syndrome is tarsal tunnel syndrome. And if that is mononeuropathy, we have to evaluate in this line. If that is polyneuropathy, we have to evaluate in the line of hereditary disorders, inflammatory diseases, infectious diseases, systemic diseases, drugs and toxins. Next question, 29-year-old man is being treated for TB and complains of numb feet. No conduction study was suggestive of neuropathy. So for this reason, we have to know what are the drugs that can cause neuropathy. Usually the drugs which cause neuropathy are anti-cancer drugs and also anti-tubercular drugs. These drugs you have to keep in mind, and based on which drug is available here, we have to think of accordingly. So which drug is most likely to cause the problem? This is a straightforward question. If you know about the anti-tubercular drugs and their side effects, you can clearly tell which drug is involved. So there will be most commonly involving drugs are usually cisplatin, carboplatin, vincristine, and also this bortezomib. These will be involved in chemotherapy drugs. Whereas in cardiovascular drugs, amiodarone is most commonly asked in MRCP. Whereas in antibiotics, it is a dapsone, it is metronidazole, it is nucleoside analogs. Whereas in central nervous system agents, it is chlorprothoxin and phenelzine. There are some other agents also like colchicine, disulfiram, etanercept, and infliximab. These also can cause neuropathy. So in our thing, it is the most commonly frequently asked question is which ATT, which anti-tubercular drug can cause neuropathy? That is isoniazid. For that reason only, for every patient who is put on anti-tubercular treatment, most of them are put on pyridoxine, because isoniazid can cause pyridoxine deficiency. Pyridoxine deficiency can cause this neuropathy. A 22-year-old man is referred for an evaluation of dysphagia. On examination, he has bilateral ptosis, facial weakness, and atrophy of the temporalis. He says he has difficulty relaxing his grip, especially in the cold weather, and that his sibling had similar history. What is the most likely diagnosis? How should we approach to this case? It is a young male who came to the hospital clinic with evaluation of dysphagia, but he was also found to have bilateral ptosis, facial weakness, and atrophy of temporalis. That means facial muscles are also weak. But the important point here, what you have to make it is the important point here is difficulty relaxing the grip. So difficulty relaxing the grip is a very important point, that too in the cold weather, because when someone is talking about difficulty relaxing the grip, it gives an entity, it gives a clinical diagnosis that he is having myotonia. So you should search for, whenever you come across this kind of description in a question, you should always look for an option called myotonia in the question. Does any of our questions, any of the options in the question has myotonia is an option or not? So when the myotonia is there, it is straight away this one. But coming to the remaining options, when we are thinking of multiple sclerosis is a brain white matter disease, brain and spinal cord white matter disease. It is not associated with any difficulty relaxing the grip. It has the association of, it doesn't present with bilateral ptosis or facial weakness. It present usually with optic neuritis. Also, otherwise they may have hemiparesis, paraparesis, hemisensory loss, paresthesias. Any such can be seen. But in the polymyositis is a rapidly progressive proximal more than distal with weakness with myalgias. So it is an inflammatory muscle disease. So that is not there in our scenario. Then motor neuron disease. Motor neuron disease is a pure motor neuron disease, usually seen with predominantly, it's a chronic degenerative disease with both distal and proximal muscle weakness, and without any sensory involvement. Myasthenia gravis, we should think of when someone is describing diurnal fluctuation with ptosis. and all these. When there is no diurnal fluctuation, we should not think of myasthenia gravis. Okay, this is a classical phasis of myotonic dystrophy. You can clearly notice a mild ptosis is there, and also there is frontal balding with an atrophy of the temporalis muscle. This is, we can see many people outside similarly, but we don't know that this is a disease. That is what, when the brain doesn't know, the eyes doesn't work. So this is a clear-cut temporalis wasting is there, frontal balding is there, mild ptosis. This is a part of myotonic dystrophy actually. Next question, 62-year-old man presents with 6-month history of progressive difficulty with speech and swallowing. On examination, she has effortful speech with a brisk gag reflex. Tongue movements are slow and effortful. Tone is increased in all 4 limbs with a pyramidal distribution of weakness, and sensation is normal. How to analyze this question? So, in this question, elderly man with a chronic history of dysphagia and dysarthria. So, but he has brisk gag reflex. He has brisk gag reflex. So, when something related to brisk word comes to the question, we should think of UMN palsy, UMN kind of weakness. Tongue movements are slow and effortful. So, there is a bulbar UMN lesion. So, tongue also may be bulbar UMN lesion. There will be spastic tongue. Spastic tongue will be always slow. Then tone is increased, that is due to spasticity with a pyramidal distribution. Sensation is normal. So this kind of spastic quadriparesis with brisk reflexes suggestive of pseudobulbar palsy with normal sensations should think of pure motor disease. So we have to search for the options which has a pure motor disease in this. So brain tumor cannot be a pure motor disease always, as it can also involve the spinothalamic tracts. It can also in brainstem tumor, there will be trigeminal nerves. Those also can be there. So they can have sensory complaints also. Cervical spondylosis with myelopathy. Cervical spondylosis is a chronically progressive degenerative disease. Patients present with neck pains and sometimes radicular pains. These all are sensory complaints will be there. So in myelopathy also, if spinothalamic tracts and also posterior columns are involved, they can have the sensory complaints. GBS is a rapidly progressive neuropathy or radiculopathy. In that, definitely sensory complaints will be there with paresthesias. Whereas motor neuron disease is a pure motor disease without sensory involvement, with the definite involvement of, if only UMN weakness is there, that is called as primary lateral sclerosis. If it is a combination of both UMN and LMN weakness, it is called as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And other one, hyperthyroidism, usually people will describe in a questions like Graves' ophthalmopathy, Graves' disease. The similar kind of descriptions will be there with the exophthalmos, and remaining findings, palpitation, those also will be mentioned as it is a systemic disease, but those things are not mentioned here. So this one I want to describe classification of motor neuron diseases. If that is UMN, it is a primary lateral sclerosis. If that is UMN and LMN, it is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. But if that is only LMN, it is progressive muscular atrophy or spinal muscular atrophy. Next question, 45-year-old man presents with paroxysmal episodes of severe right periocular pain lasting 15 to 40 minutes associated with redness of the eye, lacrimation and nasal congestion. These episodes seem to be very stereotyped and occur around 2 a.m. The attacks occur over a period of 7 to 9 weeks and then seem to remit, only to occur again after 12 months. So let's tell me briefly about the headache types of presentation. Usually if someone reports this type of headache location presenting to us, we should think of either frontal sinus or maxillary sinusitis headaches. If someone describes it in bifrontal description and bitemporal description of headaches with a band-like sensation, then we should think of tension type headache. And this migraine headaches are usually hemicranial headache, one-sided headache associated with nausea, vomiting, or photophobia, phonophobia. It can be preceded by an aura. It can have a flashes of light, distorted images, blurring of vision, doubling of vision. So to diagnose particularly one kind of headache is very important because each headache has different kinds of treatments. Each headache have different uh, durations of treatments. So that is the reason we have to definitely uh, classify the headache and plan the treatment accordingly. For that reason, we have to diagnose which kind of headache the patient is having. The last one is the cluster headache. Cluster headache is a very severe excruciating pain which is present in and around the eye, that is called as periorbital pain or retroorbital pain, that will be so severe that sometimes people will have a thought of taking a suicide. So along during this headache, the patient will also have redness of the eye, tearing from the eye, and also discharging from the nose. So these kind of headache with headache also with autonomic involvement, that is nothing but Horner's syndrome like ptosis, meiosis, and congestion, discharge. So these are called as trigeminal autonomic cephalalgias. One among the trigeminal autonomic cephalalgias is cluster headache. Okay, so this is how we, based on the description of the headache, we have to narrow down our possibilities, and then by examination we should come to the diagnosis. So here in the trigeminal autonomic cephalalgias, there are three types of trigeminal autonomic cephalalgias. First one is cluster headache, second one is chronic paroxysmal hemicrania, third one is sunkt headache. Here in cluster headache is more common in males, whereas paroxysmal hemicrania headache is more common in females, whereas sunkt headache is also more common in males. Coming to the attack duration, it is 15 to 180 minutes in cluster headache. It is 2 to usually 15 minutes in paroxysmal hemicrania headache, less than 4 minutes in sunkt headache. Okay, so based on the duration, these trigeminal autonomic cephalalgias will be diagnosed and treatment planned accordingly. So based on this information, I think you can come to the answer for this question. This patient is having paroxysmal episodes on the severe right periocular region lasting 15 to 40 minutes each episode, associated with redness of the right eye, lacrimation, and nasal congestion. These episodes always have a stereotypy. Stereotypy means they present in a same way at the same time every day. That is called as periodicity. These attacks occur over a period of 7 to 9 weeks and repeat only after this cyclical occurrence. Usually yearly they occur in either summer, either winter. Usually they occur only at that time, at one particular time in the night or morning. That is called as periodicity, and this is cyclical occurrence. So this is a classical description of cluster headache. So what is the prophylactic treatment of choice? You should know the prophylactic treatment of choice for the cluster headache. What is the prophylactic treatment of a cluster headache? Sumatriptan is usually acute rescue medication. Aspirin is a acute rescue medication. Propranolol is a treatment for migraine, prophylactic treatment for migraine. Amitriptyline is also prophylactic treatment for migraine. Verapamil is the treatment of choice for the prophylaxis of cluster headache. Okay. Next question. 37-year-old homeless man admitted with history of feeling dizzy and slightly nauseated. The following day, he developed double vision, walking difficulty, and slurred speech. When asked, he complains of mild pain situated in the back of the neck. He is drowsy and his speech is dysarthric but comprehensible. On examination, right eye does not abduct, right side facial weakness with sparing of the brow. In the limbs, he is mildly weak in the left arm and leg. The reflex in all four limbs are all very brisk, and both plantar response or extensor. Found to have ataxia and he needs support to walk. What is the most likely diagnosis? Okay, so let's analyze this question. Okay, it's a homeless man and young male admitted with history of dizziness and nausea. The following day, first day he developed dizziness and nausea. Following day he developed double vision, walking difficulty, speech difficulty. When asked, he complains of mild pain, situated mild pain. This is a very important finding. This is a mild pain. This is a very important finding. Mild pain is a very important. Situated in the back of his neck. He is drowsy and his speech is dysarthric but comprehensible. On examination, right eye does not abduct, that indicate he is having right sixth nerve palsy. And right side facial weakness is there. That side indicates in sparing the eyebrow, that indicates right side UMN facial palsy. In his limbs, he is mildly weak in the left arm and leg. The reflexes in all four limbs are brisk. That means pyramidal weakness is there. So the patient has to start with vomiting and vertigo, followed by double vision, that is due to right sixth nerve palsy, walking difficulty due to pyramidal weakness, and dysarthria probably due to facial nerve involvement. So putting all these together, but preceded by a mild pain, in the back of the neck, you should always think of this is a stroke. Stroke preceded by a neck pain, that to back aspect of the neck. We should think of stroke is nothing but something related to the blood vessels. So back aspect of the neck causing posterior circulatory stroke, we should think of vertebral artery dissection. Vertebral artery dissection. So usually this multiple sclerosis patients present with optic neuritis, hemisensory loss, paresthesias, bowel and bladder involvement. These things will be there for multiple sclerosis. Quadriparesis, hemiparesis will be there. Right subdural hemorrhage, they will not have this kind of vomiting, dizziness and all these. They will have initially a head injury. They will clearly mention they might have sustained some head injury, and over time, over 7 to 10 days, gradually they were developing one after the other complaints. In that way they will be explaining. But these kind of posterior circulatory complaints cannot be explained with right subdural hemorrhage. Carotid artery dissection. Carotid artery is most often concerned with anterior circulation. Anterior circulation strokes will never cause vomiting, vertigo, all these things. Right sixth nerve, these cannot happen with carotid artery dissection, anterior circulatory stroke. Vertebral artery dissection can happen with these things. Whereas Wernicke's encephalopathy. For Wernicke's encephalopathy, it's always the mnemonic is GOA. You should remember the word GOA. That is global confusion, ophthalmoplegia and ataxia. When these triad they are mentioning, we should think of Wernicke's encephalopathy. Okay. So this diagram clearly gives you idea what actually this is a carotid artery. I want you to clearly understand what is a dissection. So whenever someone sustains a minor injury over here, this part, so there is a minor intramural tear can happen. Due to the intramural tear, there can be within the vessel, the tear happening within the vessel of the carotid, that can lead to blood accumulation in the wall of the carotid, that causes the obliteration of the lumen of the internal carotid artery. So normally the blood has to flow this way. So this lumen gets obliterated and there will be reduced blood supply to that part of the brain which is concerned with the internal carotid artery. So that this kind of lumen obliteration causes hypoperfusion to the brain and they manifest to have stroke symptoms. And we have to definitely look for dissection. And on CT scanning of neck vessels, angiogram, we can look for double lumen. There will be two lumens in the same vessel. When we see two lumens in the same vessel in the angiogram picture, we should always think of carotid artery dissection. That is how we diagnose the carotid artery dissection. Next question. 55-year-old male presented with hypertension and diabetic, presents with sudden onset right-sided weakness, hemisensory loss and dysarthria. This occurred an hour previously while he was eating his breakfast. He is taking aspirin, simvastatin, ramipril and digoxin. So what action should be taken? So is it immediate oral aspirin, then CT scan? Is it CT scan within the next 4 hours and transfer to acute stroke? Or is it immediate CT with a view to the IV thrombolysis? Is it immediate CT with a view to heparinization? Or straight away admit to the patient with to stroke unit, and then later on do CT scan in the next 24 hours. Okay, this question is very much important. Let's analyze this question. 55-year-old male present with hypertension, diabetes. Someone is giving in the questions elderly, 55 years, and with hypertension and diabetes. These are atherosclerotic risk factors, and presenting with sudden onset. Whenever anyone asks about in the neurology sudden onset, you should think of either stroke, either trauma, or demyelination. In these three things only usually diagnosis will be there. So when there is sudden onset, elderly people with a background of hypertension, diabetes, atherosclerotic risk factors, we should think of stroke. And this happened only 1 hour ago. So this is called as golden period or window period of a stroke. This is a window period of stroke for thrombolysis. If anyone is presenting to the emergency within 4.5 hours, a neurologist's mind should be, a physician's mind should always be thinking of a thrombolysis only. So here the purpose of doing a CT scan is to do the thrombolysis within 4.5 hours. So thrombolysis. So coming to the thrombolysis is a standard thrombolysis was being done earlier with alteplase, and now even tenecteplase also got approval for it. Alteplase will be given at a dosage of 0.9 mg per kg. In that, first 10% of the dosage will be given as bolus. Remaining 90% of the dose will be given as infusion over 1 hour. Whereas tenecteplase, it is 0.2 mg per kg. It will be given over. It is just a bolus dose, no need of any infusion. But before doing thrombolysis, we have to look for possible contraindications. BP should not be more than 185/110, and the sugar should not be less than 40. Sugar should not be more than 400, and there should not be any head injury recently. There should not be any upper GI bleed. He should not have undergone any surgeries recently. So there are multiple contraindications. Based on the pros and cons, we have to see, and then only we have to take a decision whether to thrombolyze a patient or not. The next question. 54-year-old alcoholic man was found collapsed in the street. Initial CT brain scan ruled out any intracranial lesion. On evaluation, he had signs of left basal pneumonia confirmed on the chest X-ray and low sodium concentration of 118. After 3 days, his condition worsened. On examination, he developed quadriparesis and bilateral extensor flexor responses. His eye movements appear normal, as is the facial sensation, but has no gag reflex and is unable to swallow or speak. What diagnosis do you consider most likely when planning how best to investigate his problem? Okay, so this is a very interesting question. A 55-year-old alcoholic man found collapsed in the street. When someone used the word collapsed, we should think of unresponsiveness, unconsciousness. Initial CT brain scan ruled out any intracranial lesion. On evaluation, had signs of left basal pneumonia confirmed on the chest X-ray and low sodium concentration of 118. So when someone found to be unresponsive and he was brought and signs of left basal pneumonia, usually basal pneumonia cannot cause unconsciousness, but low sodium concentration can cause unresponsiveness, drowsiness, altered sensorium. These can be seen. Probably this is a case of metabolic encephalopathy secondary to hyponatremia due to chronic alcohol usage with inadequate dietary habits. Unhygienic dietary habits also can cause this low sodium concentration. But he will be obviously got treated in the hospital, but after 3 days his condition worsened. So this is a very tricky thing. On examination, he has a quadriparesis and bilateral extensor flexor responses. His eye movements appear normal. That means he means to tell that there is a gaze move, his gaze and eye movements, cranial nerves are intact. But as his facial sensation, he has no gag reflex and is unable to swallow or speak. So developing a quadriparesis, extensor plantar responses actually, extensor plantar responses. So that actually indicates that he is having pyramidal weakness. That means there is some UMN kind of lesion and there is no gag reflex. That indicates it's a bulbar palsy. bulbar palsy, gag reflex, which was happening after the correction of sodium, you should always think of any adverse effect of sodium correction. Okay, but let's go to the options and analyze them. If that was a vertebral artery dissection, as we discussed earlier, it will be usually pain in the back aspect of the neck followed by vomiting, vertigo, diplopia, dysarthria, dysphagia, and weakness. But this is not there in our case. Basilar artery thrombosis. Basilar artery thrombosis, they will be unresponsive also due to the involvement of reticular formation. But his eye movements appear normal and facial sensation, but so he is not completely unconscious. It looks like basilar thrombus people, they will be gradually going into decerebrate posturing and the vegetative state. Those things will be there, but this doesn't look like that. Okay. Central pontine myelinolysis should be thought of. The other name of central pontine myelinolysis is osmotic demyelinating syndrome. This we should think of actually, because after the sodium correction, on rapid correction of the sodium, can sometimes people can land up in central pontine myelinolysis that causes these kind of manifestations, and they present with this scenario. But Guillain-Barré syndrome will actually present with initial with paresthesias, weakness in the lower limbs followed by upper limbs. It is rapidly ascending reflexic quadriparesis, but our clinical scenario doesn't look like that. And multiple sclerosis, it is the lesion of usually patients present with, it is a brain and spinal cord disease, pure white matter disease. They will usually present with optic neuritis, quadriparesis, paraparesis. These all things will be there, bladder and bowel involvement, but this is not the case in our scenario. Okay, so out of all these possibilities, best possible answer is central pontine myelinolysis. Okay, this is the last question of the day. A 54-year-old man complains of 6 month history of heaviness and discomfort in his upper legs, which is only present after walking for 5 minutes, but able to perform cycling about 30 minutes. Recently started an antihypertensive medication. On examination, all peripheral pulses were palpable, but capillary return in his toes was slow. Motor power in his arms and legs was normal, apart from the diminished ankle jerks and reduced vibration sense distally in the lower limbs. So let's analyze this question. 54-year-old man complains of 6 months, so chronic history of heaviness and discomfort in the upper legs, which is only present after walking for 5 minutes, but able to perform cycling about 30 minutes. So this person mainly has walking difficulty. Okay, so history of heaviness and discomfort in upper legs, which only presents after walking for 5 minutes. So at rest it is not there, but an activity it is coming on. So whenever we are coming across this kind of complaint, at rest patient is not having, on activity that is coming, that is called as claudication. So there are two types of claudications. One is vascular claudication and one is neurogenic claudication. Neurogenic claudication is the one they develop complaints, symptoms when they stand or walk. Their complaints will regress and come down once they sit down and or once they lie down. But they can perform all their activities in sitting position. But here our question says, but he is able to perform cycling for about 30 minutes. So he is able to perform cycling, but our vascular claudication people, they cannot perform activity even in the sitting cycling position and also walking. So this is the striking difference between neurogenic claudication and vascular claudication. He was recently started on antihypertensive medication. On examination, all peripheral pulses were palpable. When peripheral pulses were palpable, we have ruled out peripheral vascular disease. So this looks like neurogenic claudication. Okay, coming to the options, we have ruled out peripheral vascular disease. Inclusion body myositis is actually seen in proximal muscles of the lower limbs and finger flexors of the upper limbs. So this pattern is not looking in this case. So it doesn't fit into inclusion body myositis. There's hypothyroid muscle disease, a systemic disease patient will be having, there's something called as Hoffman's myopathy that is related to thyroid disease. They'll have proximal muscle weakness, but they don't have this kind of on standing, they will be getting this complaint and on lying down the symptoms subside. Metabolic myopathy also doesn't look this way. Metabolic myopathy, second wind phenomena. First, they will develop easy fatigability, but after some time, they can perform the they can perform the activity very well. First initial, they will develop easy fatigability on performing the activity, but after some time they can perform like, even first time they can work for 15 minutes. After the 15 minutes, they have to take rest for few minutes, but then they can perform for about 1 hour also. That is called a second wind phenomena in metabolic myopathy. So among these options, neurogenic claudication happens only in the lumbar canal stenosis. Okay, so the answer is lumbar canal stenosis. So here, this is a neurology mock test discussion, which the questionnaire which we have given yesterday for the practice of the MRCP part 1. So I think this is the way we conduct the classes, and this is the structured program. We take up each question, analyze each question in deep, and we discuss each option and why we are ruling out of that option. We will discuss, and also associated theory also, with a good diagrammatic and easily conveyable way, and which a common any person can understand. So this is the way we are planning our MRCP courses in Raises Academy, and our main goal is to reach everyone so that they can perform their exam very well, and they should not waste their time, they should not waste their valid time, they should not waste their valid efforts, and they should not waste their money. So that is our main goal. To give a better quality of education is the main goal behind Raises Academy. Okay. Thank you for staying with us, and I hope you had a good session of neurology, and prepare well for your MRCP. All the best for your exams.